This isn't your land anymore, Mr. Riley. It belongs to the Oakhaven Estates community now. We held a vote. The woman's voice was a grating symphony of entitlement and cheap perfume, a sound that scraped against the quiet dignity of the 100-year-old oak trees she stood beneath. Her name was Karen Miller, president of the Homeowners Association, a fact she delivered as if announcing a royal title. She was a plus-size woman in her late 50s, squeezed into a pastel pink tracksuit that screamed both leisure and aggression, and she held a clipboard like a scepter, the flimsy plastic somehow imbued with the weight of absolute power in her mind. Behind her, the raw, bleeding wound of freshly turned earth stretched across my property, a brutal gash of red clay and mangled roots where a pristine meadow had been only a week ago. A Caterpillar D6 bulldozer sat idling nearby, its diesel fumes a foul desecration of the clean mountain air. The operator, a man with the vacant expression of someone just following orders, wouldn't meet my eyes. I had been in Washington for 10 days, finalizing the transition of my duties before my official retirement, and I had come home to this, to a road, a half-finished, unpaved, brutally carved road cutting directly through the heart of the 20 acres I had bought to live out the rest of my days in peace. A road that connected her sterile, cookie-cutter subdivision to the old county highway on the other side of my land. A road that simply did not and could not legally exist. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold, furious rhythm that I hadn't felt since my last tour in Afghanistan. I tasted copper in my mouth. For a moment, the world narrowed to the smug, self-satisfied smirk on her face, and I understood, with a terrifying clarity, how quickly a man can be pushed to violence. But I was a colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers for 30 years. Discipline was etched into my soul. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the clean air fight back against the diesel and the perfume. "You voted?" I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "You, a private homeowners association, voted to seize my private property? Property that is not and has never been a part of your subdivision?" Karen's smirk widened. We needed a second access point for emergency vehicles. It was a matter of public safety. The board approved the motion, and the measure passed with a 92% approval from the residents. "It's all in the minutes," she tapped her clipboard. "Your land was designated as an unimproved community easement. You should have been at the meeting." I felt a laugh, a bitter and humorless thing, bubble up in my chest. An easement? An easement requires the willing consent of the landowner, a legal filing with the county, and compensation. You have none of those things. What you have is a bulldozer, a monumental amount of arrogance, and a felony charge for destruction of property. Her face tightened, the smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. "We have our own legal counsel, Mr. Riley. They assured us that since your property borders Oakhaven on two sides, it falls under the community betterment provision of our bylaws. This is for the greater good." The greater good. I'd heard that phrase used to justify all manner of sins. I looked past her, at the torn earth, at the ancient oaks whose roots were now exposed and dying, at the path that led straight through the spot where my late wife Sarah and I had planned to build a small gazebo overlooking the creek. This wasn't just land, it was a sanctuary, a promise I had made to her. And this woman, this petty tyrant in a pink tracksuit, had desecrated it for convenience, cloaking her theft in the language of civic duty. The battle was just beginning, but in that moment, I knew how it would end. She had brought a clipboard to a war against a man who had spent his life designing and building the very infrastructure of the nation. She thought she was an authority on roads. She had no idea she had just declared war on the Federal Highway Commissioner. Before we dive into the beautiful, systematic, and entirely legal disassembly of Karen's little empire, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, and in the comments, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. Now, where were we? Yes, Karen was explaining her version of the law to me. I let her finish her nonsensical speech about bylaws and community betterment, my face an impassive mask. Inside, my mind was already a whirlwind of logistics and strategy. I was documenting the make and model of the bulldozer, the name of the construction company on its door, the license plate of Karen's gaudy SUV parked on what was left of my lawn. I pulled out my phone and began recording, the lens aimed squarely at her face. "State your name for the record, please," I said, my voice now devoid of all emotion. It was the voice I used for depositions and after-action reports. Her eyes widened slightly. "I don't consent to being recorded." "I don't need your consent. You are on my private property, where you are not welcome, standing beside the evidence of a crime you've just confessed to committing. Now your name?" She stammered, her confidence finally cracking under the cold, impersonal weight of the camera lens. "Karen Miller, HOA president. And you're admitting that you, on behalf of the Oakhaven Estates HOA, ordered this construction on my land without my permission?" It was a community decision for the greater good," I finished for her. "I got it." I panned the camera slowly, deliberately, across the entire path of destruction, from the edge of her subdivision to the far side of my property, lingering on the splintered fence posts and the deep, ugly ruts the machinery had left behind. Then I turned it back to her. "You have 60 seconds to get yourself and your machine off my land before I call the sheriff and report you for criminal trespass and felony destruction of property exceeding $50,000 in value." The color drained from her face. The mention of a specific felony charge, a specific dollar amount, seemed to land with more force than any angry shouting could have. She sputtered, grabbing her phone. "I'm calling our lawyer." "You can't threaten me." "That wasn't a threat," I said, turning my back on her and walking towards my house. It was a timetable. The first call I made wasn't to the sheriff. It was to my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Ben Carter, who had handled the purchase of the property for me. I explained the situation in precise military terms: date and time of discovery, the name of the perpetrator, the extent of the damage, and the absurd justification provided. Ben was silent for a long moment, the only sound on the line being the faint rustle of what I assumed were legal pads. "Jack," he finally said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and professional outrage. "In 25 years of practicing real estate law, I have never heard of such a flagrant and, well, stupid act of criminal trespass. Are you sure you're not a part of the HOA? Check your title documents." "Ben, you and I went over those documents with a fine-tooth comb," I replied, my eyes scanning the thick binder of paperwork I had already pulled from my safe. "Section C, paragraph 4, this property, parcel ID 77B, is explicitly excluded from the covenants, restrictions, and authority of the Oakhaven Estates Homeowners Association." I insisted on that clause. He let out a low whistle. "Then they're not just wrong. They're acting in deliberate violation of a recorded deed. This is a slam dunk, but a messy one." My next call was to the county sheriff's department. I reported the trespass and the damage, and a deputy was dispatched. As I waited, I walked the length of the illegal road, my phone meticulously documenting every detail: the depth of the cuts, the trees that had been knocked down, the survey stakes, my original survey stakes, that had been tossed into a pile like garbage. The deputy who arrived was young, probably half my age, with a weary look that suggested he'd seen his share of petty neighborhood disputes. He listened patiently as I laid out the facts, showed him my property plat map, and played the first part of the video of Karen admitting to ordering the work. He nodded slowly. "Well, sir, you've definitely got a case for damages." Then he walked over to Karen, who had been waiting by her car at the edge of my property, no doubt coached by her lawyer on the phone. They spoke for 10 minutes. When the deputy returned, his weary look had deepened. "Ma'am claims the HOA has documents, an old easement from the original developer, that gives them right of way," he said, avoiding my gaze. "She says it's a civil matter, a dispute over property lines and paperwork." I felt that cold fury rise again. "Deputy, look at this!" I held up my phone, showing him the clear image of my survey marker, a steel pin driven into the ground, lying in the pile of debris. "That is a legally recorded survey marker. Moving or destroying it is a misdemeanor in this state. She didn't just trespass, she actively destroyed the legal evidence of the property line to facilitate her crime." He sighed, adjusting his duty belt. "I understand, sir, but without a court order, I can't force them to stop work or remove their equipment. My hands are tied. You'll have to take it to civil court." He handed me a card with a case number on it. "File a report." That's the best I can do for you today. It was the classic bureaucratic shuffle, the pass-off that leaves victims feeling powerless. But I wasn't powerless. Disappointed, yes. Infuriated, absolutely. But not powerless. This was just the first phase of the engagement, reconnaissance and assessment. The enemy had revealed their tactics, a blend of mob rule, fraudulent paperwork, and exploiting the inertia of local law enforcement. It was time to plan my counteroffensive. That night, I sat at my large oak desk, the same desk where I had planned logistics for bridging the Euphrates, and I laid out my campaign. The first file I opened was labeled Damages. I called in a certified arborist to assess the value of the lost trees, a landscape architect to estimate the cost of restoring the meadow, and a civil engineer to quote the price of removing the compacted roadbed and remediating the soil. The initial estimate came back at just over $80,000, a number that would get the attention of any judge, and more importantly, the HOA's insurance company. The second file was legal. Ben Carter was already drafting the lawsuit, but I gave him a new directive. I didn't just want to sue the HOA as a corporate entity. I wanted to name every single board member personally. Piercing the corporate veil, Ben called it. If they voted to approve this illegal act, they were personally liable for the consequences. Suddenly, the abstract concept of an HOA vote would become a very real threat to their personal assets. The third and most important file was labeled Karen. I knew instinctively that this wasn't just about a road. It was about power. I needed to understand my enemy. I spent the next 48 hours conducting a deep dive. Public records, social media, old newspaper articles. Karen Miller had been the HOA president for 10 years. She had run unopposed in the last 4 elections. A search of county court records revealed a dozen lawsuits filed against the HOA during her tenure, mostly for petty things like fines for unapproved mailbox colors or liens for overgrown lawns. Most were dismissed when the homeowners gave up or moved away. But I also found 2 cases that had been settled out of court, the records sealed. Interesting. I cross-referenced the plaintiffs' names with property records and found they had both sold their homes within 6 months of the settlement. They had been silenced and driven out. This wasn't just a mismanaged HOA, it was a racket. My strategy was beginning to crystallize. This wouldn't be a single, head-on legal assault. It would be a campaign fought on multiple fronts: civil, financial, and psychological. Karen thought she was protected by her board, her lawyer, and her binder full of bylaws. She was about to find out what happens when you bulldoze a road through the backyard of a man who sees rules, regulations, and logistics not as obstacles, but as weapons. She had started a war over a stretch of dirt. I was going to end it by burying her in a mountain of her own paperwork. The first volley was the official survey. I hired the most reputable firm in the state, a company that did work for the Department of Transportation. I didn't just want my property lines remarked. I wanted them documented with the kind of obsessive precision that would be unassailable in court. For 2 days, a team of surveyors in bright orange vests descended on my land. They used GPS transponders, laser transits, and ground-penetrating radar. They didn't just find the original steel pins, they located the concrete monuments buried at the corners of the original 19th century land grant. The result was a 20-page report, complete with topographical maps, aerial photographs, and a legal description of my property so detailed it could have been written in stone by God himself. The new survey was filed with the county clerk's office the next morning. The bright pink survey flags now fluttered along my property line, a stark visual repudiation of Karen's land grab. The illegal road was shown to be, at its deepest point, a full 50 feet inside my property. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It was theft, pure and simple. Ben Carter attached the new survey to the cease and desist letter and the preliminary bill for damages. It was sent via certified mail to the HOA's official address and to the personal homes of Karen Miller and all 4 board members. The letter was unequivocal. Cease all activity, remove all equipment, and respond with your plan for remediation within 72 hours, or a lawsuit would be filed. For a moment, I thought the show of overwhelming factual evidence might be enough. Perhaps faced with irrefutable proof, they would see the folly of their actions and retreat. That was my mistake. I was applying logic to an illogical situation. I was dealing with a zealot, and zealots don't retreat. They double down. The HOA's response came not from a lawyer, but from Karen herself. It was a letter printed on Oakhaven Estates letterhead, slipped into my mailbox. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. The first paragraph informed me that I was being fined $500 for unauthorized installation of signage on community-facing property, referring to the surveyor's flags. The second paragraph fined me an additional $1,000 for failure to maintain the new community access path in a clean and debris-free manner. An astonishingly bold claim that I was now responsible for the upkeep of the road they had illegally carved through my land. The third paragraph was the real kicker. It stated that per the HOA's legal counsel, my new survey was invalid, as it was not commissioned by the HOA's own architectural review committee, and that, until their own surveyor could review the discrepancy, the road would remain open and was to be considered HOA common property. They had not only ignored the cease and desist, they had used it as a justification for levying more fines against me. It was so absurd, so completely divorced from reality, that I had to laugh. They were trying to use their own internal, nonsensical rules to override state law and legally recorded property deeds. This letter was a gift. It was proof of bad faith. It demonstrated a pattern of harassment and an unwillingness to resolve the issue rationally. Ben was ecstatic when I read it to him over the phone. "Jack, save that letter," he said, glee in his voice. "Frame it. That's Exhibit A in our motion for punitive damages. They're not just wrong, they're malicious." The construction crew, which had paused for a few days, returned. A truck arrived and dumped a load of gravel, and a grader began spreading it along the illegal road. They were paving it. The audacity was breathtaking. They were actively creating more damage, increasing their liability with every pass of the grader's blade. I stood on my porch and filmed the entire thing. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them. I just documented. Every action they took was another nail in their own coffin. It was at this point I realized my initial strategy was too narrow. A civil suit would take time. I could get an injunction to stop the work, but that would also take weeks to get in front of a judge. I needed to open a new front, one they wouldn't see coming. I needed to shift the battlefield from property law, where they clearly felt comfortable ignoring the facts, to a domain where the rules were rigid, unforgiving, and ruthlessly enforced, my domain. I went back to my desk and pulled out a different set of maps. Not property plats, but federal and state environmental surveys. I knew my land contained a small, spring-fed creek that ran through a patch of wetlands. It was one of the reasons I bought the property. Sarah had loved watching the deer and the herons there. According to the Army Corps of Engineers' own maps, that creek was designated as a navigable waterway tributary, which gave it certain federal protections under the Clean Water Act. And the new road? It crossed directly over that creek. They hadn't installed a culvert or a bridge. They had just bulldozed the creek bed flat and filled it with dirt and gravel, effectively damming it. The clear flowing water was already backing up, turning into a muddy, stagnant pool. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was a federal crime. My hands moved with renewed purpose. I began drafting a new set of letters, not to the HOA, but to the Environmental Protection Agency, the State Department of Environmental Quality, and my old colleagues at the Army Corps of Engineers. The letters were calm, professional, and filled with technical details. I included GPS coordinates, photographic evidence of the damage, and cross-references to the specific statutes they were violating. I didn't write as Jack Riley, angry landowner. I hinted at my background, using the precise terminology of a seasoned engineer and government official. I wasn't just filing a complaint, I was submitting a professional case file. Karen thought she was fighting a retired old man over a fence line. She had no idea she had just picked a fight with the entire regulatory apparatus of the United States government. The wheels of that bureaucracy might turn slowly, but when they finally started to grind, they turned everything in their path to dust. While I waited for the federal and state agencies to process my reports, the HOA, emboldened by my lack of immediate, visible action, pressed their advantage. The gravel road was completed and a new sign was erected at the entrance from the subdivision. Oakhaven Estates, West Gate, It was an official-looking sign, green with white reflective lettering, as if it were a municipal street. Karen was creating the illusion of permanence, of legitimacy. She sent out a triumphant community newsletter, which one of my new disgruntled neighbor allies forwarded to me. The lead story, accompanied by a picture of a smiling Karen pointing down the new road, was titled New Connector Road, A Triumph of Community Spirit. The article was a masterwork of self-congratulatory propaganda. It spoke of overcoming selfish anti-community interests to provide a vital second access for first responders. It praised the board's fiscal responsibility in completing the project under budget, a budget funded, of course, by illegally seizing my land. There was no mention of me, my property, or the pending legal action. In Karen's world, the fight was already over, and she had won. She announced a formal ribbon-cutting ceremony to be held the following Saturday. The entire community was invited. There would be a bounce house for the kids, a barbecue, and a speech by Karen herself to dedicate the road. It was to be her victory lap, a public celebration of her power. This was the moment I had been waiting for, an opportunity to strip away her carefully constructed narrative in the most public and humiliating way possible. My allies within the community were growing. My first contact was a quiet man named David, who lived 2 doors down from Karen. He had been fined repeatedly for having a small vegetable garden in his backyard, which Karen deemed agriculturally inappropriate for a residential aesthetic. He was an accountant, and he hated Karen with a quiet, simmering passion. My second ally was a woman named Maria, a single mother who had been threatened with a lien because her son's basketball hoop was, according to Karen, a non-compliant permanent structure. They were good people who had been bullied into silence. When I showed them my file, the survey, the lawsuit, the proof of Karen's flagrant disregard for the law, it was like a dam breaking. They began talking to other neighbors, sharing their stories. A secret Facebook group was formed. A petition demanding an independent audit of the HOA's finances began to circulate. The seeds of rebellion were sown. While the community was quietly organizing, I was coordinating a different kind of party. I made a series of phone calls, not as a civilian, but as a commissioner. I spoke to the regional head of the EPA. I spoke to the district chief of the Army Corps of Engineers. I spoke to the State Transportation Authority. In each call, I laid out the situation with cold, hard facts. I explained that a citizen's complaint had been filed regarding these violations, and that I had a professional and personal interest in seeing that they were investigated promptly. I never once explicitly stated, I am a federal highway commissioner, and you need to do this for me. I didn't have to. The title on my email signature and the professional courtesy in my voice were enough. I simply asked them when they planned on conducting a site visit. When they gave me their timelines, I made a polite suggestion. It seems the responsible parties are holding a public event at the site this Saturday at 2 p.m. It might be an efficient time to engage with them directly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a slow, knowing chuckle from the EPA director. Yes, Mr. Riley, he said. That does sound efficient. The trap was set. The pieces were in place. Karen had planned a party to celebrate her victory. She had no idea she had sent out invitations to her own public execution. On Saturday, the sun was bright and the air was warm. From my porch, I could hear the sounds of the party starting up, the squeals of children in the bounce house, the sizzle of burgers on the grill, the upbeat pop music playing from a cheap speaker. I watched as Karen, dressed in a flowing, floral print muumuu, greeted her neighbors like a benevolent queen. At precisely 2 p.m., just as she stepped up to a small podium with a large pair of ceremonial scissors, the first vehicle arrived. It was a white Ford Explorer with the official seal of the County Code Enforcement Office on the door. It pulled right up to the entrance of the illegal road, blocking it. The music faltered. A few moments later, a second vehicle, a dark green Chevy Tahoe from the State Department of Environmental Quality, pulled in behind it. Then came the third, a heavy-duty Ford F-250 with the unmistakable castle logo of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Doors opened, and 3 individuals in official jackets, all holding clipboards and looking profoundly serious, emerged. They bypassed the party and began walking the length of the road, pointing at the destroyed creek bed, taking photos, and planting small yellow flags in the ground. The festive atmosphere evaporated. The chatter died down. Everyone turned to stare, first at the officials, then at Karen, whose face had gone from triumphant pink to a mottled pasty white. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The scissors clattered to the ground. I walked calmly from my porch down my driveway and met the officials at my property line. The lead inspector, a stern-faced woman from the EPA, shook my hand. "Mr. Riley, I'm Sandra Gibson. We received your report. It seems the situation is even more egregious than your photo suggested." She held up a device that was taking water turbidity readings from the now stagnant creek. "These levels are off the charts, and this unpermitted fill in a federally protected wetland. This is a major violation." She turned towards Karen, who was now stumbling towards them, her face a mask of confusion and rage. "Ma'am, are you the party responsible for this construction?" Karen looked from the inspector to me, her eyes narrowing with dawning horror and betrayal. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You did this!" Sandra Gibson's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, I'll ask you again. Are you the responsible party?" A stop work order was slapped on the signpost. A notice of violation with an initial fine of $50,000 was handed to the trembling HOA treasurer. The party was over. Karen's public humiliation was absolute, but it was only the beginning of her unraveling. Like a cornered animal, she didn't surrender. She lashed out, making a series of critical, irrational mistakes. Her first act of retaliation was to file a lien against my property. It was a move of pure, spiteful arrogance. The lien claimed I owed the Oakhaven Estates HOA the sum of $25,000 for non-payment of special assessments related to community infrastructure improvements, namely the illegal road they had built on my land. It was a legal absurdity. You cannot place a lien on the property of a non-member for a service they never requested and actively opposed, especially when that service was, in fact, an act of criminal trespass. When Ben Carter received the notice of the lien, he actually laughed out loud. "This is the best thing she could have possibly done for us, Jack," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "This isn't just harassment anymore. This is slander of title. It's a malicious and fraudulent claim designed to damage my client's property rights. The penalties for that are severe. We're not just going to get the lien thrown out. We're going to ask the judge for sanctions against her and her lawyer for filing a frivolous and bad faith claim." The lien was the trigger. The moment it was filed, Ben's carefully prepared lawsuit was launched. It was a legal bombshell. We sued the HOA for trespass, destruction of property, and the cost of remediation. We sued for slander of title because of the fraudulent lien. And as promised, we sued Karen Miller and each of the 4 board members, Timothy, Brenda, George, and Susan, personally. The lawsuit argued that their actions were so far outside the scope of normal HOA business, so willfully and maliciously illegal, that they were not protected by their status as board members. They were personally liable for the full $80,000 in property damages, plus punitive damages to be determined by the court. The effect was instantaneous. Within 48 hours of being served, I received a panicked phone call from George, one of the board members. He was a retired history teacher who, I suspected, had just gone along with whatever Karen said. "Mr. Riley," he stammered, I had no idea. Karen assured us. Her lawyer said it was all above board. We just voted on what she presented. I can't afford this. My wife and I were on a fixed income. This would ruin us." "George," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you are a board member. You have a fiduciary duty to the homeowners to perform due diligence. Did you ask to see a survey? Did you ask to see a signed easement from me? Did you question how the HOA could legally seize private land?" There was a long, guilty silence on the other end. "No," he whispered. "We just trusted Karen." "Then I suggest you and the other board members get your own lawyer," I advised, "because the one representing the HOA is clearly only interested in protecting Karen, and he is giving you catastrophically bad advice." That conversation was the first crack in Karen's wall of support. The board members, who had been happy to ride her coattails when it was about power and petty rules, were now facing personal financial ruin. Their loyalty evaporated. They turned on her, demanding to see the legal opinion that had justified this mess. Of course, there was no such opinion. Karen's lawyer, a sleazy strip mall attorney who specialized in HOA bullying, had given her verbal assurances, likely based on her own distorted version of the facts. He had never put anything in writing because he knew it was indefensible. The board was in a panic. Meanwhile, the federal and state investigations were proceeding with terrifying efficiency. The EPA fines were mounting daily. The Army Corps of Engineers was demanding a full environmental impact study and a multi-million-dollar remediation plan to restore the wetlands, a plan the HOA had absolutely no way to pay for. The illegal road, once a symbol of Karen's power, was now a financial black hole threatening to swallow the entire community's assets. The residents of Oakhaven Estates, who had blindly voted for the road, were now facing a massive special assessment to cover the fines and legal fees. The triumph of community spirit had become a fiscal catastrophe. Karen's response was to dig in deeper. At an emergency HOA meeting, she tried to frame the entire debacle as a conspiracy, with me as the villain. She painted me as a wealthy, selfish outsider, using my government connections to persecute their humble community. "He is trying to bully us into submission," she bellowed, her voice echoing in the community center's gymnasium. "But we will not back down. We will fight for our right to public safety." It was a good speech, full of righteous indignation. It might have even worked had it not been for David, the quiet accountant. He stood up in the back of the room, holding a stack of papers. "Karen," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stunned silence, "I have a question about the budget. I've been reviewing the financials, and I found something odd." He had found the key. While Karen was busy building her illegal road, she had forgotten to cover her tracks. David, the accountant, was my secret weapon. While I had been focused on the external, legal, and regulatory battles, he had been waging a quiet war from the inside, poring over years of HOA financial statements, bank records, and invoices he'd obtained through a formal records request. What he found was not just mismanagement, but outright fraud. Karen had been using the HOA's debit card as her personal slush fund for years. Hundreds of dollars for board meeting lunches at fancy restaurants where no one else on the board had attended. Thousands in landscaping supplies from a home and garden store paid to a company that, upon further investigation, was registered to her brother-in-law and had no other clients. The most damning evidence was related to the road project itself. The construction company that bulldozed my land was owned by Karen's cousin. The invoice they submitted to the HOA was for nearly double the standard rate, a clear case of kickbacks and self-dealing. At that chaotic emergency meeting, David laid it all out. He didn't use rhetoric or emotion. He just presented the facts, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, invoice by invoice. He showed the residents how their dues, the money they paid to maintain their neighborhood, were being siphoned off to fund Karen's lifestyle and enrich her family. The room, which had been simmering with anger at me, slowly turned its focus to the woman on the stage. The murmurs grew into shouts. People who had been fined for their garbage cans being out too long or for having the wrong shade of beige on their shutters were now seeing where their money had really been going. A woman stood up, her voice shaking with rage. "You fined me $200 because my daughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were an unapproved modification, and you were using our money to buy yourself steak dinners?" A man waved a piece of paper. "I got a lien notice because my grass was 3 inches tall. You were paying your cousin twice the market rate for a job that has now brought federal agents to our door." The narrative had completely flipped. I was no longer the villain. I was just the catalyst, the rock that had been kicked over, revealing the rot and corruption underneath. Karen stood at the podium, her face ashen. She tried to dismiss it, calling it a misunderstanding and a smear campaign, but the evidence was overwhelming. The board members, seeing their chance to save themselves, publicly denounced her. "We were misled," Timothy, the board vice president, announced into the microphone. "We trusted our president to act in the best interest of the community. That trust was clearly misplaced." The meeting devolved into chaos. A motion was made from the floor to immediately remove Karen Miller as president. It passed with a near-unanimous roar of approval. A second motion called for a full forensic audit and for the findings to be turned over to the district attorney. That, too, passed overwhelmingly. Karen was stripped of her power in the very room where she had wielded it for so long. She was forced to hand over the keys to the community center, the HOA checkbook, and her beloved clipboard. She stumbled out of the meeting, no longer a queen, just a disgraced woman facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges. The community had taken its first step toward healing, but my own battle was not yet over. The road was still there. The damage was still done. My lawsuit was still pending. But now I was no longer fighting a hostile entity. The new interim HOA board, led by a chastened Timothy and an empowered David, reached out to me the very next day. Their tone was entirely different. They were apologetic, cooperative, and desperate to make things right. "Mr. Riley," Timothy said over the phone, his voice heavy with exhaustion and regret, "on behalf of the Oakhaven Estates community, I want to offer our sincerest apologies. What happened was inexcusable. We want to settle this. Tell us what you need." My demands were simple and non-negotiable. First, the lawsuit would proceed against Karen Miller personally, but I would agree to a settlement with the HOA and the other board members. The terms of that settlement were that the HOA's insurance would pay for the full, verified cost of the land remediation, my legal fees, and a significant punitive damage payment, which I would donate to a local conservation charity. Second, they would issue a formal public retraction of all the lies Karen had told about me and the project. Third, and most importantly, they would be responsible for the complete removal of the illegal road. Every last bit of gravel, every ton of compacted dirt had to go. They had to restore my land to its original grading condition, under the supervision of my own hired engineer. They agreed to everything without hesitation. The fight was won. But I still needed to deliver the final, symbolic blow. I needed to ensure that this could never, ever happen again. I needed to put a permanent, physical end to the road that had caused so much trouble. And I knew exactly how I was going to do it. The day the moving trucks appeared in front of Karen Miller's house was a gray, overcast Tuesday. The bank had foreclosed on her property to cover the initial wave of legal judgments against her, and she was being forced out of the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist. The community she had lorded over for a decade barely registered her departure. Her reign had ended not with a bang, but with the sad, quiet squeak of packing tape. It was on that same morning that my own delivery arrived. Not a moving truck, but a convoy. 3 massive flatbed trucks, each carrying a series of colossal, interlocking concrete Jersey barriers, the kind you see dividing lanes of traffic on a federal highway. They were 10 feet long, 3 feet high, and weighed over 2 tons each. I had purchased 30 of them. A heavy-duty crane followed the trucks, its yellow arm folded against the sky. I stood at the end of my driveway, coffee cup in hand, and watched as the crew got to work. I had my surveyor's report and a can of bright orange spray paint. I walked the entire 300-foot length of my property line that bordered the Oakhaven subdivision. I painted a thick, unmissable orange line directly on the asphalt of their street, precisely where their community ended and my private property began. There would be no more ambiguity, no more room for misinterpretation. The crane operator was a master of his craft. With delicate precision, he began lifting the concrete behemoths from the flatbeds and lowering them into place one by one, directly on my side of that orange line. Each barrier landed with a ground-shaking thud, a percussive note of finality. They were placed end to end, forming an impenetrable, unbroken wall of solid concrete. It was stark, it was brutal, and it was beautiful. It was the physical manifestation of a legal boundary, a declaration in steel and stone that said, "This far and no further." As the last barrier was being lowered into place, I saw Karen's moving truck pull away from her house. It had to drive right past my property to get to the main road. I saw her in the passenger seat, her face pale and drawn. She looked out the window and saw the wall. She saw me standing there, watching. Our eyes met for a brief moment across the distance. There was no triumph in my expression, no malice, just a calm, quiet finality. Her face crumpled, a mask of impotent rage and defeated pride. She had tried to take my land to build a road, and in the end, her actions had resulted in a permanent, immovable wall. The irony was thick enough to taste. The truck turned the corner and was gone. I never saw her again. The completion of the barrier wall was the symbolic end of the conflict, but the real work was just beginning. Over the next 6 months, my property was a hive of activity. The disgraced construction company, as part of their own settlement to avoid a lawsuit, was contracted to undo the damage they had done. They brought in excavators and dump trucks, not to build, but to dismantle. They scraped up every ounce of gravel. They dug out the compacted earth they had used to fill the creek bed. Slowly, painstakingly, the ugly scar on my land was removed. A team of restoration ecologists, paid for by the settlement money from the HOA's insurance, came in next. They carefully regraded the land to its natural contours. They replanted the meadow with native grasses and wildflowers. They brought in river stone and carefully rebuilt the banks of the creek, creating gentle riffles and pools to restore the natural flow of the water. I watched the process every day, a deep sense of satisfaction growing in my chest. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. It was about healing the land that a petty tyrant had wounded for her own selfish purposes. The new HOA board proved to be a group of reasonable, responsible people. They worked with me at every step, signing off on the restoration plans and ensuring the payments were made on time. The forensic audit of the HOA's finances had led to a criminal investigation by the district attorney. Karen and her cousin were eventually charged with embezzlement and fraud. The community of Oakhaven, freed from her oppressive rule, began to heal as well. The draconian rules were relaxed. The atmosphere of suspicion was replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness. People started planting gardens again. Kids' chalk drawings reappeared on the sidewalks. It became the kind of community it was always meant to be. My final act was to ensure this could never happen again. Not to me, not to anyone who might own this land after me. I worked with the conservation charity I had donated the punitive damages to and placed the entire 20 acres into a permanent conservation easement. The land could never be developed. Its meadows, its forests, and its precious wetlands would be protected forever, a sanctuary for wildlife and a quiet testament to the importance of standing your ground. One evening, nearly a year after it all began, I sat on my porch as the sun went down. The meadow was thick with black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers. The creek gurgled softly, the water running clear and clean again. A doe and her fawn stepped cautiously from the woods to drink. There was no road. There was no sign. There was only the quiet, enduring peace of the land. I had come here seeking sanctuary, and I had been forced to go to war for it. But in the end, the victory wasn't just in defeating Karen or in winning a lawsuit. The victory was in this moment, the quiet, the calm, the restoration of order. It was the reaffirmation of a simple, powerful principle, that a person's home is their castle, and no self-proclaimed queen in a pink tracksuit has the right to bulldoze a path through the throne room. The rule of law had prevailed, not because of some grand, abstract ideal, but because one person, pushed too far, had decided to read the regulations, file the paperwork, and fight back with the very tools the system provided. And that, I thought, as I watched the last light fade from the sky, was a victory worth fighting for.